Good morning, everyone, and warm welcome here from EFAMA and also the colleagues from DTCC. We have a special hour planned for you for the next 60 minutes. We'll be discussing preparing for EU T+1. And the title of the webinar could very easily also have read Preparing for EU, UK, Switzerland, T+1. As we know, the three markets are aligned in terms of timing. So really delighted to see you today, Laure and Matt. Of course, we're especially happy that you're going to, I hope, bring all the experience you have from the US transition, which by all accounts went very well, despite all the kind of alarmist attitudes that we heard prior to the transition. So I think in terms of settlement discipline and settlement fails, it was all a very successful transition. So yeah, really glad to kind of spend some time discussing this with you. I think in particular for this group, speaking to the asset management community, it would be great to kind of connect the dots. So look at what the ESMA draft proposal, yet to be published, but the technical standards coming out of ESMA as far as settlement discipline, what those are looking like, how this joins up with what we're getting out of the EU T1 Industry Committee as far as the high-level roadmap. And what does that mean concretely in terms of operational change within a firm? And how do you start to look at sort of adapting your processes and what does automation look like? So I think this is really where you can add value to discussion for us here. And I do want to invite people on the call to use the chat function to put your questions in there. And I know Laure and Matt are very happy to take questions throughout, the presentation. I think we want to make this as interactive as possible. So with that, I'm going to introduce you both formally. So Laure Fauchet is Director of UK Government Relations, so based out of London, as is Matt Johnson, who's Executive Director at DTCC, and I believe you've been there over 10 years, and you will both walk us through this presentation. So thanks so much for joining and making time this morning, and over to you, Laure.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thank you all for joining us today. So let me first start with the legal and regulatory landscape. So as you can see from this slide, a lot has been achieved over the past 2 years. In the EU, a key milestone was the report from ESMA in November 24, recommending the move to T+1 with a target date of 11 October 2027. This was followed by a rapid legislative progress, with the Commission bringing forward some proposals to amend CSDR and the co-legislator quickly reaching political agreements by June 2025 to provide the legal basis for the move. And this was possible because there was clear recognition that a shorter settlement cycle could deliver some important benefits for European markets in terms of risk reduction, improve settlement efficiency and liquidity, and also global competitiveness by reducing the misalignment with the US. And other markets like the US had already demonstrated that T+1 is achievable. So this helped accelerate decision-making. However, the structure of EU markets is fundamentally more complex than in the US, as you know, with multiple jurisdictions and currencies and a wide range of market infrastructures, including over 30 CSDs, and also different legal, fiscal, and regulatory frameworks, as well as different market practices. So to address this complexity, a robust government structure was put in place to ensure coordination between public authorities, ESMA, the Commission, and so on, and market participants. And as part of this, an industry committee was established, supported by a number of dedicated technical work streams. So in June 2025, the committee published, as you know, its high-level roadmap, setting out detailed recommendations for the transition. And this was followed also by the publication of a handbook in February this year to provide further operational guidance for implementing those recommendations. And on the regulatory front, also in October last year, ESMA also proposed amendments to level 2 settlement discipline requirements to support, as you mentioned, Suzanne, the implementation of the roadmap and necessary changes to market practices. So in parallel, there have been similar coordinated efforts in the UK and Switzerland with alignment on the same go-live date. And in the UK, the Accelerated Settlement Task Force published its implementation plan in February last year. And the government also published draft legislation to amend UK CSDR. As for Switzerland and Liechtenstein, they are advancing their own transition through the Swiss Securities Post-Trade Council, which also published its T+1 recommendation at the end of last year. A key difference being that the Swiss market is subject to self-regulation. So the settlement cycle is based on the 6 exchange rules, and the transition in Switzerland does not depend on legislation there. But overall, so to sum up this slide, the key legal, regulatory, and industry milestones are now in place. So the transition is happening, and the focus of the industry is now shifting towards implementation and coordination and testing. And so like the main question for us, like for market participant now, will be what does this mean in terms both of operational changes that need to be made, as well as the regulatory expectations, which we will touch on the next slide. So let me just move to the next slide. So if we take a closer look at the recommendations developed by the UK and the EU task forces, we can see that there is a strong level of convergence, and this reflects the significant coordination that has taken place between the public authorities, the task force chairs, and the industry. And DTCC, us as well, we were a part of different work streams and different working group across the UK and the EU, and we could see that these groups were very joined up. So this is positive because it helps reduce fragmentation and allow for, given the big interconnectedness across the Europe, the EU and the UK. So just wanted to highlight a few key areas in terms of the recommendations. So first, both the EU and the UK reports place a strong emphasis on standardization and automation and on eliminating manual intervention across the post-trade lifecycle. And this is to reduce settlement failure because there's a much shorter window to address errors. And in particular, they both highlight the need to move away from manual SSI processes, so manual standing settlement instruction process, which has been identified by trade association and research as one of the key driver of settlement fails. The two reports also recommend completing allocation and confirmation on trade dates and using electronic standardized communications. For us, this is one of the most significant recommendations because by completing these processes on trade date, firms have more time, as I said, to identify and resolve errors. And importantly, as we've seen in the US, the move to T+1 has demonstrated also that automation is a key enabler of same-day confirmation. So it's very important to make those processes almost real-time as possible under a T+1 environment. And another important point to highlight is that both reports recommend providing the place of settlement, so preset data, at the point of allocation to ensure the early identification of discrepancies and necessary realignment. This is directly in the EU roadmap. In the UK roadmap, it's not directly recommended, but it's deferred to the industry associations, which have now come up with best practices. So in effect, it means this is a key recommendation for both the UK and the EU, which will need to be implemented as well. And Matt will touch on what we're doing on our side to help with delivering that. And beyond that, some other key areas of focus from the task force included so recommendation to facilitate the use of CSD tools to improve settlement efficiencies like partials and hold and release, and recommendations covering securities financing transactions, FX and corporate actions as well, which all need to be aligned with the shorter cycle. One important difference, I think, in the EU roadmap is the introduction of a standardized operational timetable, which sets out specific timings for various post-trade activities, the so-called gating events. And this was designed specifically to help manage the operational complexity of the EU ecosystem. And so, like, this slide is very busy, but it's only a very handful of key points that are actually in the report. So I would encourage everyone to read the reports because I'm not able to cover everything in one slide. In total, the EU roadmap contains 30 recommendations and 57 sub-recommendations across the value chain. And the UK Code of Conduct includes 12 critical actions and I think 27 highly recommended actions. So it's just to highlight, these numbers are important because they illustrate the scale of the operational changes that will be required, and the need for each organization to then conduct its own impact assessment and gap analysis. But one question, because I think you wanted to ask me about regulatory enforcement when we discussed in preparation for this presentation. And so I wanted to...
Sorry, I was just going to comment briefly on the slide. I mean, yeah, it's busy, but equally, it's a very nice sort of summary of the key recommendations that you find in the high-level roadmap. And I think you've done a nice job on the left, where you reference the ESMA technical standards, which complement and kind of map onto the T+1 changes we're seeing. So I think those are well put. I mean, you mentioned the cutoffs for allocation confirmations, the PSET as a mandatory field, and then, of course, maintaining SSI data and passing it on to investment firms. I think one question that maybe the group has, and I certainly have, we saw the draft ESMA RTS back in October. It was submitted to the Commission. I think I briefly heard back in January from ESMA where they said, yes, we had a couple of questions to them. I can even sort of voice them here. I think one of the concerns was the current wording of the technical standards made it sound as though if you went beyond the 2300 cutoff for allocation confirmation and 2359 for the SSIs, that the CSD would just reject the trade, and that I don't think that's the case. And so there's a few things that need to be kind of ironed out in this final technical standards. So yeah, we're still waiting. So I don't know if you have any updates as far as timing of publication.
Yeah. So in terms of this, how the recommendations will be enforced. So I just wanted to backtracking a bit to say, the recommendations follow the adhere or explain approach. But then, as you said, there are two things. One is worth also highlighting that supervisory authorities could take these recommendations into account in their oversight activities. So that's one thing. And then the second point is that some of the recommendations directly mirror or some of certain amendments of the RTS from ESMA on settlement discipline directly mirror the recommendations. And these are listed on the slide, but it's not exhaustive. So there are other areas which are also in the recommendations. And in terms of timing, so the date of entry into force that is considered in the RTS is 7 December of this year. We were expecting maybe to see those RTS already approved by the Commission by this time. However, the latest we heard from the Commission is that they were still hoping, they are still reviewing the RTS, and we're still hoping to validate them this quarter, and with the expectation that this could be there could be non-objection from the Parliament and the Council and publication in the official journal by Q3 at the latest. So that was the expectation at the end of last quarter. So there could still be some changes if there are further delays, but I would say at this stage we are still on track to have the RTS validated before the entry into force, which is December. So I think it's too early to assume that there will be any delay, and firms should plan on the basis that this will enter into force in December. And also, this is very EU focused because there are a lot of things to consider. But on the UK side, I just wanted to flag also that the UK Code of Conduct, which contains all the recommendation of the task force, will form part of the FCA ongoing supervision as well. And the FCA has actually written a letter to the compliance officers of investment management firms to clarify its expectations ahead of the transition. So it is there's definitely going to be some scrutiny from the FCA starting this year in terms of looking at whether firms are implementing the recommendations. So unless there's any questions on this slide, I might move on to the next one. So in terms of, the recommendations we discussed are relevant for, most of them are relevant for all the market participants across the value chain, but the EU and the UK reports also include some specific recommendations for the asset management sector, and notably regarding fund settlement cycle. So currently the subscription and redemption cycles in Europe range from T+2 to T+4, and T+3 being, I think, the most common. And so the move to T+1 creates some potential misalignment and liquidity mismatch between the assets and the liabilities of the funds. So in response to this, the EU roadmap has recommended shortening fund cycle to T+2, but also to retain some flexibility where needed. And that's particularly where transitioning to T+2 is not feasible due to distribution or operational considerations for the fund. And then, in the UK, the task force has taken a similar approach, recommending a move to T+2. But I would say there is an increased scrutiny from the FCA, which does expect that funds would transition to T+2 unless there's a strong justification not to do so. So my interpretation is that there's a little bit of more scrutiny and from the FCA basically in the UK. And I think Switzerland was also planning to align with the EU on this approach last time I heard. I don't know if you heard anything more on this, Suzanne.
Yeah, no, just to, echo what you've said. There probably isn't a standard settlement cycle that we can point to. So I think, as you said, it ranges from T1 and in some cases all the way to T4 plus. The recommendation that came through that we worked on for the high-level roadmap was indeed that, shortening fund cycles should be considered, and that's a good way to manage the cash misalignment, certainly. But there were other mitigating factors, including, as you said, distribution, operational capacity, and others. So I think in Europe, it still remains very much voluntary, and the industry is still looking at how quickly do we align. I think even for those that are furthest out, so T3, T4, and beyond, the idea is that they will transition to a shorter fund settlement cycle, but perhaps not by the October 27 deadline. So it will come sometime after that. But I think that's probably the main feedback here. And I don't know, are you going to talk about the cash breaches or?
Yeah, in terms of industry feedback, also in the recent surveys, we've seen that, cash breaches is a risk and a key challenge that has been identified by the industry ahead of the transition. I think the survey from Value Exchange identified that 39% of asset managers expect cash breaches at least weekly under T+1. So I think this is also an area where there will need to be further industry collaboration and potentially regulatory clarification might be needed ahead of the deadline. So it's still an evolving discussion on this topic.
I fully concur with that, Laure, about the cash breaches. This is a topic that was actually on our radar long before the EU transition. So even when we were looking at the US, of course, the same scenario arose where you would, have cash coming into the account before you settle. So that scenario was already sort of being addressed. We've done a lot of work with ESMA and the NCAs, and I think for the large part, we are confident that treatment of cash breaches will not be disruptive, so they will be treated as non-reportable and passive, so therefore not requiring, additional reporting and remedial action. So that's really the best we can hope for, non-reportable and passive treatment. One market that we sort of, I think required a little bit more clarification was with Ireland. But I think even there, as long as you're not keeping the cash with a single counterparty, so if you go above 20%, you will have to sort of, spread that between two counterparties, but it is still possible to have, to go above the UCITS thresholds. And as you were mentioning, some of those calculations that you rightly said, sort of expectation once we move over to T+1, higher rate of breaches, that's for the ETF community. ETF community that have exposures to,
Asia and
Asia
underlying,
and so
yeah.
on. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's why I was also thinking there needs to be a bit of industry collaboration to address those specific topics and identify the right solution for those models. But yeah, you're right. Thanks for adding this point. In terms of other big challenges specifically for the asset management community, I think it's also a topic that has come up a lot is FX funding, which is another challenge under shorter cycles. So firms will need to review whether their current FX operating models are fit for purpose under T+1, but that's not new. I just wanted to remind about this because it will there will need to be some changes in processes to manage FX funding. But more broadly, just to go back to some of the key themes also on the slide around automation and SSIs, I think that, because of the significant operational timelines pressure that asset management will have to face, this really reinforced the need for automation in core processes, including trade matching, SSI management. And, without this, firms risk an increase in headcount cost and settlement risk. And in the past, one point I wanted to flag is that one of the constraints that has often been raised in the past, particularly for smaller investment manager, was the cost of implementing automation. But I think this is evolving now, and Matt will also expand shortly on some of the solutions that are now available to help address these challenges in terms of cost and technology. So yes, just wanted to point to highlight this. And I think we also discussed ahead of this call how, in the US, when firms had not automated, they suffered an increase in overhead costs. And I think that the statistics that was shown from the survey was like 18% increase in cost, which shows it's not sustainable to just throw bodies at the issue. And the way forward is just to try and automate processes as early as possible ahead of the deadline. So the next slide I wanted to touch on briefly is the current status of industry readiness and where we stand today. So this survey is a little bit dated, and we're going to see results from a new survey in the coming days or weeks. But I having discussed with some of the organizers of the survey, some of the messages are the same. So I'm going to go on with these statistics because they haven't moved much, basically. And so if we look at the results of this survey, we can see overall the picture is very encouraging, but it's uneven. And so on the positive side, around 77% of firms are now actively engaged on T+1 in Europe, and 1/3 already have an implementation plan in place, which is really positive. And also 30% of the recommendations have already been implemented. So there's good progress, but there are still some gaps. And so a couple of areas that are important to watch going forward. So first, as you know, 23% of respondents have not yet engaged at all with the transition, which is a bit concerning given how much we have this topic has been discussed with the industry. So this would be one of my primary area of concern. And also still 50% of firms will need to define their implementation plans. So there's not much time left to agree on budget and planning. So this is also an area to watch in the next survey results. But even more concerning is that 30% of firms don't know yet when or even if they plan to implement the recommendation. And this number rises to over 50% for the asset management community. So I think this shows that there needs to be further discussion in terms of implementation of T+1 with the industry. And one area that is raising concerns directly with the industry committee is that over half of respondents said they could miss the December 26th deadline for completing the allocation and confirmation on trade date. And if you read also the other statistics on that box, which is the one with the dotted line, this seems to partly reflect just insufficient investment in automation, because there's only around half of firms planning to automate their communications flow before the 27 deadline. So just to sum up this slide, there's growing awareness and momentum, which is very positive. And I think if you compare to other jurisdictions, like there's still a lot of time left, and it's still, the EU is in a good position for a smooth transition. But there remains a need, I think, for greater collaboration and discussion across the industry, as well as further investment in automation to ensure this transition goes well.
Can I maybe react a little bit also to this the value exchange data that you're showing on the slide? So I agree with you. It gives kind of a ballpark idea of how things are evolving, and that's fine. I think there is a little sensitivity, like in ascribing too much importance to this data for a number of reasons. Firstly, as you know, it's such a massive survey, and just making sure that, each individual entity, or like people who are on the call, if they're actually represented in these results, I'm not entirely sure. And one of the reasons is that buy side was not segmented. So you had pension funds and other institutional investors that sit behind us that were, responding to these questions, and they, expect another actor to take care of some of this, if you see what I mean. So for that reason, it's a little off. And I mean, just like looking at the 56%, the one you have in the dotted line, I mean, that number of 56 could miss, this earlier target of doing allocation confirmation by 2300 by the end of the year. Like, that doesn't resonate at all, if I'm honest. We've done sort of, what should we say, informal polls with the members, and we were very close. So, like, there were no issues. I mean, people were already doing all of this on T0. Certainly, like, seeing a number like 56% just seems well. So I think I'm really looking forward to the next iteration of the survey as well. But definitely agree with you that no room for complacency. And I think we may come to this later, but Laure, I will say, and this is why it's so important that we have both you and Matt on the call today, the blind spot that we have as a EFAMA is the smaller players, small and medium size asset managers. I don't hear from them. I mean, it's a long trek to get to Susan Yavari. So I don't know is the answer. Maybe the national associations have a little bit of a better sense. But those are the guys I don't know. And I don't know, what they would do to these numbers if it was just that size of firm that we were polling. But if there's an area to be concerned, it's those guys, I would say.
Yeah, and just to also clarify, the 56% here is across the whole 1,000 of respondents, which is not just the buy side. So it's all sectors of the financial services industry. And I know that all the large asset managers, for instance, are already doing allocation confirmation in an electronic way and on T0 in general. I mean, Matt can maybe come on that, because he has visibility of the activity in ITP. But so yes, I wouldn't take this with too much granularity, and we need to continue to review progress, maybe at a more granular level across the buy side, to understand where are the pain points. But I do think there is a bit less awareness with smaller and mid-sized asset managers. And so we're really happy to provide more information if needed for those firms to help with their transition. So I don't know if there's any other question or comments from you or Matt, or otherwise I'll just move on to this is actually my last slide. So thanks for bearing with me. And so this slide is just to highlight what firms should be doing now. And so the task force and the regulators have identified 3 main phases for a successful transition, which are planning and implementation and then testing. And so by now, as you can see on in the first column, firms should have are generally expected to have already engaged with the recommendations and defined a clear project plan and secured the necessary budget for the move. So 2026 will really be the critical year for implementation in Europe. And firms are already now moving into that phase where they are starting to actively make those changes that they have identified in their planning. So changes to, their system and processes, and starting to implement automation where appropriate. So for us, we think there's a particular focus needed on areas like allocation, confirmation, and SSIs, as we discussed. This is really emphasized by the two task forces as a key factor of success, and was also demonstrated in the US as a really important enabler of smooth transition. For the asset management sector specifically, I know T+1 is readiness is a strategic imperative. Suzanne, is there anything you would like to highlight for the audience in terms of preparation, what firms need to do now?
No, but thank you for the very nice sort of visual on this. I would maybe just add, some of the work we've seen coming out of the EU T1 industry committee in the last few months, which was the focus on testing. I had the pleasure of being in London for the UK launch of the testing plan. And I think what came through for us were two things. A, we don't engage directly with the FMIs. So the priority for asset managers is, interacting directly with the custodians, and those discussions that we need to have in terms of what their cutoffs are going to be, because that is not a given, the 2300 then leading to the 2359. There could be custodians, smaller ones, boutique custodians that go for much earlier cutoff, and so those conversations need to be had earlier, if there has to be a push to later cutoffs, or at least knowledge that this is what you're going to face looking at the various custodians that service you. So that tended to be sort of the focus, at least for now, on the buy side.
Yeah, and I think like you raise a really good point where, I think it's my last bullet point in the second column, is that every asset managers and firms in general should, review their arrangements with their third-party providers, their counterparties, to ensure there is alignment across the settlement chain. And so funds have fund managers and investment managers have a lot of different counterparties and service providers, from, fund administrators, transfer agent, custodians, as you said. So I think it's having those discussions will be really important to ensure end-to-end resilience ahead of the move. So yeah, and testing you mentioned, I think this will be critical to ensure readiness. It was very important in the US as a key factor of success as well. And so we've participated in the task force testing workstream to help share some information about this. And so what firms should do now is, testing both at individual level, but also across the ecosystem through these coordinated industry-wide testing windows. So that this is the highlight basically from the EU, UK, and Switzerland joint testing plan, which was released, I think, in March this year. And so from DTC perspective, we have, as I said, we've been actively engaged with the UK and the EU task forces and with policymakers and market participants to provide technical expertise and to share the lesson learned from the US transition, including, what went well, what went not, what could have been even better, to support a smooth transition in the UK and the EU. And so, so we're very happy to continue having those discussions to see how we can share some of our metrics and our expertise in technical areas. So with that, I will hand over to Matt, who is going to talk you through, so how can some of these challenges be addressed in practice? What are the solutions available? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laure. And thanks again to Susan and the team at EFAMA for inviting us to talk to you guys today. So the next, again, I'll run through some materials in a few slides to focus more on some of the specific parts of the T1 implementation plan, dates to look out for, but also give more of a general update in regards to the institutional trade processing, or ITP, part of the DTCC business I represent, and the ITP business is obviously home to platforms such as CTM and Alert. So what we saw during the US transition to T1, where obviously we were the global project lead in regards to that particular transition due to our our unique position in the UK markets, being not just the matching platform and Alert and SSI repository, but also more importantly being the CSD and also the CCPs. And what we saw, especially as we came out of the T1 journey from a US perspective, and we started to engage more with European regulators, trade associations, policymakers, and so on, was there was still probably an incorrect view of what DTCC does and what it is. There was a view that DTCC is only for US markets and US clients. It only operates in US currencies and for clients that are domiciled, in North America and Canada. However, that's completely false. The ITP business itself is global in nature and always has been very, very prominent across securities markets, in not just in the US, but also very prominent in the UK and Europe. So we wanted to put together a timeline and like the evolution of the business going all the way back, to the early 80s for the first inception of Alert, and then through to core periods at the early part of the turn of the century when the OMJO business was built, and we've now brought central matching into post-trade workflows. Apologies for the size of the text. Obviously, there's quite a lot of information to be on here, but obviously we will be sharing materials after the call. And obviously moving all the way up the time frame through to 2024 with the implementation of the US move to T1. And obviously now we're very core to a lot of the conversations that are ongoing. Myself and Laure have sat on various technical work streams as part of the UK task force and also European or EU industry committee, not just because people wanted to understand the lessons learned from the US, although it was a seamless transition, relatively successful. There were obviously things that probably could have been done better, and what you'll start to see and hear more now is what those lessons were. And there's a lot of focus on things such as corporate actions processing, FX and securities lending that Laure spoke through on the previous couple of slides. But the biggest impact from my perspective was international investors and how the US migration maybe could have focused a little bit more on the investment that comes into the US out of region. Again, so that's something we're extremely focused on and extremely passionate about as we start to move towards more automation for post-trade markets as we move to T1, because I think Laure and Susan put it really well earlier, where obviously we're losing time from the financial day, and the only way to really keep up with time is to make sure that you've created and enabled as much automation as you can from execution all the way down through to core settlement. So I think and again, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if there are any questions, comments or opinions, please feel free to interrupt me or stop me if there's anything in particular you'd like me to focus more on.
I'm channeling all my members, Matt. These are all questions that they're sending me. But so interestingly, you said lessons from the US, and one that personally kind of resonated with you was investments out of the US into US or global flows. Was there anything specific you wanted to raise about that? I'm just curious, because I know like on the FX side, we had a lot of concerns going in, which in the end kind of were smoothed out.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you saw there.
Yeah, it very much came down to time zone challenges. Obviously, with the US being, hours behind the UK and Europe and so on. And obviously, there's now a lot of focus coming out, not just from UK and Europe, where we obviously sit right in the middle of the global time zone, but we're now starting to hear murmurs from Far East, Hong Kong, issuing consultations for T1. So when we talk about the importance of international investors, it's not everybody is domiciled in the time zone where the accelerated settlement is taking place. So if you're in front of the UK, if you're behind the UK, you really need to start to think about tools that your teams can use. Can these platforms still run overnight or first thing in the morning? They're not codependent on someone being there. The nature of the ITP business is to let the transactions flow into our architecture, and then we literally take care of that processing on behalf of our clients from there. And there's some metrics that we'll share, but one of the interesting points that we've seen, especially from press in the UK is very much around the amount of volume that gets settled across Crest in the UK market that actually comes from CTM. Around about 30% of the volume that settles in Crest is processed via the CTM matching platform again, and we continue that relationship and broaden in, our relationships with the core ICSDs and CSDs across Europe, the likes of Euroclear, Clearstream, Euronext, and SIX, and so on. So what we wanted to do on this particular slide was kind of follow on from some of Laure's points in regards to, the key parts and the key recommendations that we really feel firms need to focus on. So we've put some detail on the left-hand side. Obviously we fully support the recommendations from the UK Task Force and the EU Industry Committee, and we want to make sure we do as much as we can, not just for our clients, but for the markets in general, to make sure that automation can be open to everybody. And we've got some slides on how we plan to do that as well, with some new ideas and new services that we'd like to bring to market. Again, we're working extremely closely with the task forces and the technical work streams, very much so with the FMSB in regards to the fantastic work that they've been doing in regards to reference data, standing settlement instructions, bringing out the core principles in regards to SSI mandates and standards that obviously DTCC's alert platform, complies to all of those core principles. And then from a recommendation perspective, something that I always like to remind folk as much as possible is, even though the T1 transition will happen in October 2027, so Laure and Susan's points earlier, there's two key pieces that are actually going in December 7 and December 31st this year, when the UK and Europe will recommend that the confirmation allocation process is completed on T0, 11 p.m. Central European time for EU traffic, and 11:59 T0 for UK. And again, it's making sure that the ITP solutions are running in lockstep with these. So obviously, CTM being a platform that's open 24/5, it offers central matching. And today we already see, nearly 99% of securities transactions that are processed across CTM. That is happening on T0. So it's making sure that firms are prepared. We talk about place of settlement that we'll go into a little bit more detail on, but the place of settlement, or PSET, needing to be present on all confirmation and allocation messaging. And again, the CTM platform allows that today. We also go as far as allowing our constituents and clients to match the PSET, so people can be completely settlement ready and locked in for settlement on T0. And of course, we own the alert database, which is literally the global SSI repository for the financial markets. And again, before, the way we look at alert, it doesn't just allow our clients to enter their SSI data into alert. One of the key constituents and key drivers for the quality and validation of the data in alert is the vast majority of it is now coming from the core providers. So on behalf of the buy-side community on the call, around about 60% of the SSIs that are present in alert today actually come directly from the global custodians and the prime brokers. So we're making sure we're receiving golden source data from those source providers. And I think we're at about 17.5 million SSIs now in alert, and that's 60% data, or delta, of SSIs coming in from the core providers. We see that growing and growing and growing quarter on quarter, year on year. Another key important message is the instruction to settle as well. So both UK, EU recommendations state that not just the confirmation allocation process be complete, that SSIs are stored electronically, where possible, SSIs and PSETs enriched onto data. Instruction to settle down through your custody network via the globals, via the subs, or obviously for the sales side, again, more often than not, direct participants. That instruction should happen on T0. Obviously, we see that the recommended cutoff is 23:59 Central Europe for European transactions, and then Crest have got that slightly elongated to be 5:59 AM on T1. Of course, if you don't meet these deadlines, it doesn't mean that your trades will fail. It's just, if you do meet these deadlines, there's a much, much higher chance of those transactions settling in the market on time correctly. Again, so we wanted to put together a table and a matrix that details, you know, the real key things that are going to happen this year and through next year, looking at some of those timeframes, but then also layering in and giving the clients the level of comfort that obviously the ITP suite of services is running in lockstep with these recommendations. I'll pause this if there's any more questions or opinion. I do have one eye on time, so when we mentioned about the manual buy side, or what's been called as the long tail of buy side firms that have still not yet fully embraced automation, there's always a number of barriers that are mentioned in regards to why firms can't get to fully automation from a post-trade perspective. Technology, cost and resource tends to be the top three. So what we've done from a DTCC perspective is we've analysed the market, we've looked at what our clients need and what they like, especially the sell side firms, that, you know, 50% of their volume is going through, you know, the larger sophisticated buy side firms, like firms that are on this call today. However, there's still a lot of volume that goes through from this long tail of smaller, less sophisticated European buy side firms. So what we've done is we've put together what we've called our T1 enablement package, and it's extremely focused at these smaller firms that don't have, you know, huge resource and huge funding, you know, to be able to run large technology projects to implement full automation. So what we've done at the end of last year, we pushed this out in a phased launch. We started with Germany, UK, and France because that was the feedback we got would be the big jurisdictions, and then we moved into Italy, Spain, Nordics, and from Q1 this year, we've now broadened the approach to cover all of Europe and UK. So what the automation package does is, for an extremely low price point, so for £100 per month, or 135 euros per month, we can offer an online service of CTM, which gives people access to our web-based user interface. We've got full upload functionality as well as trade enrichment. So we can completely automate a firm's post-trade process for, you know, for that 135 euros price point. Very cognizant of the focus and importance of SSIs, as well as PSET needing to be a field that's on messaging now. We've also bundled in a light package of alerts, which is part of our assist package, which gives a low-level degree of functionality to buy-side firms. Again, we can automate that, not just the allocation confirmation process. We can also pair that with SSIs, and we will allow enrichment as part of that process, so firms can get their PSET onto transactions. And then the final part of the module is what we call Settlement Instruction Manager, or SIM. So this is completely optional. Firms can then take advantage of DTCC's European Swift Gateway. So not only can we automate the allocation process, allow transaction upload, SSI storage and enrichment onto the messaging, we can also then send instructions down to market on behalf of buy-side firms. So if a firm doesn't find it cost efficient to have their own Swift gateway, we could then take part of that process. So we're taking the trade capture, the matching allocation, SSI enrichment and storage, as well as instruction to market. So we can then offer this package as it is to these smaller firms. And obviously, as it's a UI that's based or hosted on the internet, integration, you know, is easy, it's cheap, the price point is low. And again, we're bringing this to market because we just feel it's the right thing to do. You can probably agree that we're not gonna be making lots and lots of money from this service, but we just feel it's the right thing we should be doing for the markets, especially for such a huge transition for some of these firms again. Oh, sorry, Susan, I think you're on mute. I can see you talking.
Yeah, thanks. I was saying that there is a question that's come through. And so thanks for walking us through the service. You call it T+1 enablement package.
Yes.
And I think a very relevant question has come through in terms of, you know, bringing together all these requirements that we've been looking at with you and Laure for the past little while. So if you don't mind, I'll read it to the group and then perhaps you can
yeah, of course.
answer it. Yeah. So in light of the upcoming move to T+1 and the proposed amendments to the RTS on settlement discipline, could you clarify whether your tool is able to detect on trade date and in a timely manner any mismatches between the allocation confirmation data processed through the tool and the settlement instructions expectors submitted by brokers?
Yes.
custodians or CSD participants, particularly with reference to key settlement-related fields such as PSET, partial settlement indicators, gates, and other relevant settlement parameters. Yeah, so again, because PSET obviously is going to be a mandatory field
Yeah, of course.
as a result of the ESMA
Yeah, absolutely. So
standards.
to answer the
Mm.
first part of the question, yeah, the CTM platform, it highlights what we call mismatches. So if someone comes in with a price of 10, the other side's got 11, that will be visible instantly within the platform. So that's the benefit of central matching. So you're not waiting for the other side of the trade to tell you what they've done or what they're missing or what they're doing. All of that is completely visible from day one. In regards to, yes, we also, like we said, we don't just allow firms to put PSET on a transaction. You can enrich a full set of SSIs. So as a buy-side firm, you will be able to see your corresponding execution broker's SSIs and then vice versa, as well as having the ability to enrich the transaction with PSET. And then also for firms that want to, they can then match on PSET as well. What we've done as well to really help our clients is we've enhanced our data analytics suites. So what we're showing today is just a basic dashboard that all firms that are CTM clients get access to their own data. And we're allowing firms to look at their, what we would call their match agreed rates, so how many trades were booked versus how many matched and agreed with their counterparties. We've got specific milestones, so firms can now track behavior, throughout certain points of the day when transactions are being booked, received, allocated, and matched, and so on. We're also starting to focus a lot more in regards to the specific places of settlement, like the CSD BICs where transactions are settling, PSET enrichment rates, how PSETs are being enriched onto the data, whether it's via one of our own tools or whether firms are doing it manually. And again, the reason for doing this is we think that allowing firms to review their performance, across multiple dimensions, gain real-time T0 insights as to what's happening with their transactions and their data, but then providing a very consistent, daily view across all the different functions that you're operating from a post-trade perspective too. And again, there's a huge amount of tools that are at our clients' fingertips. There's some more detailed analysis where you can run peer reports, but I would say that some of the reports that clients ask for are payable, whereas the core set of data analytics is available to every single client that uses our CTM product, even to the point that if you're using our lower touch automation or enablement package, you would also get the same access to your data. And I know we've got a few minutes left, but one thing I did want to highlight to the firms on the call, thanks Laure, is PSET. And we are mandating that PSET becomes a field that must be populated on all CTM messaging. This mandate will go live on October 3rd this year. And the reason we're bringing it in this year is we want to make sure that our clients can meet all of their obligations and recommendations that are coming out from the task force as well as the EU industry committee, especially around, same day metrics, same day allocation, and then more importantly, PSET being present on all settlement and allocation messaging. So like I said before, so as of October 3rd this year, from October 4th, as it were, when it goes live, would be that if a transaction does not have the PSET relevant on the CTM message, it will hit what we call a fatal error. So the trade cannot get into the platform to be matched. We've done, well, hopefully everybody on the call, this wouldn't be a surprise to them. Obviously, we've worked extremely close with Laure and the government relations team, as well as the marketing team, to really increase the amount of information that we're publishing to market. Obviously, on our DTCC landing page, our T+1 site, there's a host of materials, research papers, and links and so on in regards to the mandate and other things that we're doing. But again, we wanted to make sure that we brought this mandatory requirement in to allow firms to meet their obligations by the end of this year. So again, everyone will then be fully ready and fully prepared as we move towards that October 11th, 2027 date. I think on the next slide, Laure, we've just put some statistics in there. Again, slightly small text, but basically what this is showing is the amount of transactions that are in the CTM platform. Like the orange amber bars show where there are missing PSETs today. But what you can see from that light green line that's now starting to decline, that means that more and more P sets are being added onto transactions. And this volume is this data is slightly stale. It goes back to February this year. But as of February, just under 3% of trades in CTM did not have a P set. And I think when we run our next cut of data around about May and June, that 3%, I believe, is now decreased to just under 2%. So we are now starting to see that P set is being added by all of the relevant constituents and players to the transactions.
Matt, we had another question come in, and I have one of my own, so I'm just going to throw both questions at you quickly. The question that came in is, does CTM support ETFs? And my question was quite basic, but you know, when you were describing the scenario, if you take a smaller asset manager that decides to subscribe to your service, you know, and then if there's a mismatch with the counterparty, just wondering, like, what is your footprint with the counterparties? I mean, there's an assumption there that they are all onboarded and using CTM. Otherwise, how will they know that there's, you know, I'm saying 10 and they're saying 11. So if you could take those two, that would be great.
Yeah, the first one's very easy. Yes, ETFs can be processed and matched on the platform. That's not a problem at all. And then in regards to the other part, mismatches and so on, what's the best? I'm trying to think the best way to kind of answer. So, yeah. Sorry, could you just double check the question with me again, please, Susan? The second part.
Yeah,
I just want to make sure I answer it in the right way.
In order because in response to the other question, you said, well, CTM will detect if there's a mismatch in the SSIs. And I said, well, in order for that to happen, you need to be sure that you have the other counterparty onboarded. So I just wondered how that looks from your end.
So the enrichment process takes place for both sides. There's a number of ways firms can enrich the SSI data onto the CTM messaging. There's what we call the alert keys, which is the country, security, and method. So if when the firms are using CTM, they can switch on specific keys that will then call for that data to be pulled automatically, and that just happens instantly. We also have a more bespoke platform called Alert Key Auto Select, or ACAS, and what that allows clients to do is pick their own rules about which SSIs they want to pull for particular funds, because we know some funds under management may have different custodians, and there may be different reasons why they need to settle in different places. So that all happens automatically, and you can obviously see the mismatches as part of the platform. And I think the other part of the question was around community and the clients that we have. So obviously we don't know who our clients are not, but we do have over 2,000 buy-side firms globally using both Alert and CTM. And I think there's around about between 550 to 600 clients domiciled in the European region or the European jurisdiction that are actively using the platform. And the enablement package we're bringing out, due to its easy integration and low cost, that's where we're hoping to maybe get more community growth across the European region by allowing these smaller firms that have got limited resources a way to completely automate their post-trade process.
Mm-hmm. And the other part of my question, thanks for that, Matt, was simply that on the sell side, your footprint is so large that they are already using CTM, so that they would have okay, that's good.
Correct. Yeah, we've got over 1,200 execution brokers using the platform, so it's actually very rare for a broker to not be on the platform.
Okay, perfect. That's super. We have come up to time. I don't know if there was anything else that you both wanted to share with us this morning, or anything, last message.
I think the only thing from me but I think in the very last page of the materials, and again that we will be sharing, there's just some relevant links to white papers, research papers, surveys, DTCC T+1 website, where we will be publishing a whole raft of metrics and data. So we obviously heavily encourage the participants today to go and take a look at the webpage.
Excellent. So I think, thanks so much. Very glad that we invited you. I think this has been a really very productive session. I hope people on the call feel the same way. So thanks so much for making the time. We're already being asked to send on the presentation, which I know we will. The recording will be available on the EFAMA website as well. So people who want to have another listen or to share it with colleagues can do so as well. And I think we'll leave it there. So thanks so much, Laure and Matt. Really lovely to have you. Great discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thanks everyone for taking the time.